Hello and welcome to the Majlis Podcast, ready for Radio Liberty's current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. I'm Muhammad Tahir, host of the Majlis and Radio Radio Liberty's media manager here in Washington, D.C. It's been 1 year since the eventful parliamentary elections in Kyrgyzstan, which led to so many additional events, developments and changes for the better or worse in the country. So on today's Majlis Podcast, we will take a look into some of the major events that followed that election and their implications. And of course, we will also talk about the upcoming parliamentary elections and political scene ahead of this important poll. So there is a lot to talk about, and let's dive into this. To do so, I'm joined by Dr. Emil Jurayev, Bishkek-based political scientist, Sania Tokhtugazieva, constitutional law expert in Bishkek, Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio Liberty's Central Asia blog, Kishlog Owazi. Bruce is joining us from Prague. Thank you, colleagues, for being with us today on this important conversation. An important anniversary, Dr. Jurayev, which led to many changes in the country. I mentioned a couple of them in my intro. So let's start with you. So what's been the most consequential among all the things that happened over the past 1 year?
I think it's very difficult to pick out something that is the most consequential, but clearly the most consequential was the fact that a sitting government fell as a result of highly manipulated, highly broken elections. These days last fall, and a new leadership came, a highly populist, opportunistic leadership led by Sadur Japarov. And the very fact of them coming, he and his team, has really unfolded a wide array and really sort of a shopping spree of events ever since. Most importantly, change of the constitution, in terms of the institutional and political changes, but the events that led to the change of the constitution, the ways in which it was done, I think all of this is really very difficult to uncouple and single out something as outstanding.
I think, speaking of the Constitution, Sania, you are our constitutional expert here. So what's been your take on that front and the efforts to bring these changes into the Constitution?
Definitely, I agree with what Emil already said. For me, as for the lawyer and the constitutional law expert, I think the most challenging part of this year was the fact that the way how the constitutional referendum has been organized, entirely with unprecedented violations of the procedural rule and the content of the constitution itself. I think many things are yet to come, because currently in Kyrgyzstan we're experiencing the inventory of the laws, like almost 400 laws. The way how they're being rewritten is also is done behind closed doors. All the laws related to the criminal justice are being rewritten again. And for a lawyer, actually, the way how they're treating the law, in my opinion, is exacerbating this legal nihilism that had been compiling all these years. And it is really worrisome, because at the end of the day, when society, generally the Kyrgyz population, will stop trusting the laws for 100%, I'm really afraid that these laws can be substituted by moral norms or religious norms or other social norms, especially given the fact that most of the norms, like the moral norms, traditional values and all these things have been already integrated within the constitution. It's just a matter of time how those provisions will be unpacked. So therefore, that is the most significant thing that happened this year. The change of the constitution and the ongoing inventory and the reform in institutional and in all criminal justice system, etc.
On the institutional changes, though, feel free, Emil, if you want to jump in here. Otherwise, Bruce, this question goes to you. Aside from the constitutional change that Sani was talking about, also Emil mentioned earlier, institutional change. One of that is his efforts for empowered presidency. I don't know if this is the right way to put it. What's your take in terms of the type of change that he tried to bring?
Well, in some ways it's kind of hard to say, because so much has happened in the last year. Certainly, he's concentrated almost all the power into his own hands. So whenever he talks and says this is what's going to happen in the country, you know that there won't be much debate on that. And we still have the old parliament in, and their mandate expired, also almost a year ago. Yeah. So a lot of people consider it an illegitimate parliament, but they seem to go along most of the deputies with whatever he wanted to do. I guess under the new constitution, he has enough power that he probably wouldn't even need their support that much, but they've gone along with him too. It's been difficult to gauge how deep the power is entrenched in the office of the presidency, just because, like I said, there's been so many other things going on at the same time. Some I would suggest by design. I mean, there's some that are not. Clearly, the health care problem associated with the coronavirus is something that's beyond their control. They've had problems with the Tajik border and things. But some of the other things, the arrests of detentions of officials from previous administrations and corruption investigations and things like this, almost, it's gotten so pervasive. I mean, it's there in the news almost every day that you wonder if some of this isn't a distraction to keep people's attention away from other matters that are going on within the presidency, what he's doing to further concentrate power into his own hands. It's certainly a bad sign that no one challenges him very often, and this is something else that associated with his presidency and the new powers that he has, is Kyrgyzstan has traditionally had people who are willing to voice opposition to ideas from the president, and even groups that were willing to do it. But relative to Kyrgyzstan, it's been pretty quiet. And I get the impression, and I've certainly read some articles that hint that, this is because of pressure on anyone who's willing to speak up or trying to speak up against Japarov and his team. If you are going to get up and say something bad about them or criticize them, you're going to come under pressure really, really quick. It's not like that didn't exist before, but they got a lot more public attention. Whereas, a lot of people that we've been used to hearing voice complaints or criticisms of the government, Omar Bektekibayev being one, but there's others in there too. They've been relatively quiet, and it's very strange that they have been that quiet. And I interpret that as meaning that they feel threatened some way if they challenge this president.
That's exactly actually where I wanted to bring you, Emil. Like, whenever there is an election in Kyrgyzstan, you expect certain political pressure on opponents. But how his first year could be compared with the first years of any previous presidents in Kyrgyzstan in terms of applying that sort of tactic? And also feel free to say what you had in mind.
Yeah, I think in your previous question, you raised the question of institutions and institutional change. Yeah. I think what's happening in Kyrgyzstan in the circumstances that made it possible to come to this state of affairs in Kyrgyzstan is very serious problem with institutions. Institutions of governance in Kyrgyzstan have been hollow. They have been so inconstant and so open to manipulation that when it came for those institutions, formal constitutionally set institutions, to resist tampering and abuse, they didn't stand. And what is happening with the parliament that Bruce said, the parliament that's been sitting 1 year over the term that the constitution showed, that is exactly the evidence of how institutions have been hollow. And generally, when it comes to highest level institutions, it's all been dependent on persons, on individuals at the top. So right now, I think looking back at this year that's elapsing, I think we can see this leadership came in at last year at the beginning with a very high level of popular support. I think that needs to be objectively admitted that almost no other president at entering the office, either way, through elections, we had only one president coming in with elections, actually. Well, besides Akayev. But every time a new leader comes in, they did not enjoy that level of mobilized, loud, vocal support that Sadr Japarov has enjoyed. Now, he has been wasting that support, clearly, over this year. And as he has wasted, and as he has quite clearly made lots of mistakes and blunders along the way, I think it has also opened the way to sort of an almost paranoid feeling, preoccupation with security of his government, of his rule. And in coming up to the elections, that'll be in 2 months, I think what we see is really an awareness that just the way they came to power, the current leadership, things can turn away from them, and Kyrgyzstan can plunge again into this sort of turbulence. And as to this relative silence that Bruce was talking about, I think it's somewhat common Kyrgyzstan. That was happening in Kayev's times as well, in Bakiyev's times as well, and even in Atambayev's times. The majority of the parliament always agreed and voted the way the presidents wanted until the streets overturned everything. And so I think this relative seeming calm, I would not be so counting on.
Okay. So let's talk about the feelings in the street a little bit later. Emil, one more point I wanted to take, Sania, your thoughts on that. In our previous conversation, I vaguely remember you saying that you will be looking into how he treats what was that, constitutional body or the Supreme Court judges? There were some appointments that you thought are coming up. So any thoughts on that? I mean, has there been any change from that perspective?
So definitely, according to the new text of the Constitution, President has a lot of power or the influence over the judiciary up to the appointment of the Chief Justices of the both Supreme Court and Constitutional Court. So the Constitutional Court hasn't started working yet because they're waiting for the law to be adopted. So in that respect, but the composition remained the same. I think there was a secret deal actually between the sitting judges in a way that they would uphold the constitutionality of these amendments. In return, there would be the guarantee that they will remain at their seats. So I think there was a secret deal. I'm pretty sure about it, actually. Otherwise, like any lawyer who knows the way how Constitution works and the rule of law would have never delivered this decision. And there is one more thing that I really want to highlight about the consequences of this Sadr Japarov's regime, essentially, is that I think currently the fact that he himself came with this very populistic and nationalistic slogans, along with deliberate ignorance of rule of law, created a condition that he is now completely surrounded by the opportunists who are using their positions for the purposes of to satisfy their own ambitions and hidden motives. For instance, like Kurmanko Zuluşev, the general prosecutor. So by using his position, now he's rewriting all the criminal codes in a way that soon he's going to become the second person in the constitution after the president. At the same time, we see Tasheyev also using his position constantly, like exceeding his powers and involving in those areas that actually he does not have any power according to the constitution. Or look at what Akhilbek Japarov is doing, the Minister of Economy, again rewriting the tax codes, laws in relation to business, Kumtor, like he brought the Tengiz Bolturuk now, and the way what they're doing now behind closed doors, it's like, again, I think there was a hidden motive for them to gain something. And the deputies, like there are recently 2 deputies, they came up with the initiative on amending the laws on our central bank, which in itself making it more like less independent and integrating something called financial technologies in the finance. And they also have the personal interest because it seems that with the strange Russian banker Vladimir Frolov, they're now lobbying the interest to enter into our market. So this is really something that is bringing a huge destruction at the level of the rule of law and at the institutional level. If before there was the more or less some checks and balances mechanism, now that we don't have it any longer, it's just creating the perfect condition for such a team or the opportunities to come and to use our resources, our law and our institutions for the purposes of satisfying their own ambitions and hidden motives. This is unfortunately, I think, something that is really bad that is happening currently in Kyrgyzstan, which will have definitely the most negative consequences sooner or later.
And those who question, their policies, they are dealing with them heavy-handedly. Sania, I don't know whether there's a bigger story behind that. Earlier, you posted either on Twitter or somewhere else, your Instagram account has been hacked. Hacking in other form of cyber attack is, of course, a major intimidation tactic these days globally. So how big of a operation is this? Are you the only one being singled out, or there are more in terms of the pressure tactic through the cyberspace and others?
So it's the Telegram account. It definitely was. So my account was hacked. Zamir Joshev, he's also an advocate. Klara Soronkulova, a woman candidate for the president, and Rita Karasartova. So they're both running under the political party reform. So my Facebook is constantly trying to be hacked several times. And then I think the biggest scandal that happened is actually in January, our services had been wiretaping more than 100 activists, lawyers, politicians, legally by the sanction of the court, which is the gross violation of our fundamental constitutional rights. And actually today, Zamir Joshov, the attorney, also published in his Facebook account, because we were planning to apply to the court and we needed those documents. And so they said that half of them have been destroyed and the rest are now under secret, so they cannot share them with us. So yeah, it's the level of basically gross violations that this current regime is doing is really unprecedented, especially if before other regimes, they used to, say, attack or threaten mostly the oppositions, the politicians. Now, somehow, they're threatening the lawyers who are not even in the politics. We don't have any ambitions to participate in the elections. We're just there to tell what laws are being violated, just to uphold the rule of law. Unfortunately, yes, different tactics are being used to threaten, to hack, to wiretape. And it is, of course, to a certain extent, is very irritating, but somehow I already got used to that. We just wanted to continue and apply to the court, but somehow now we cannot have access to all those documents. Even though we have that the Ministry of the Interior and the Press Secretary of the Первомайский Sud court have confirmed that there was the fact of wiretapping and there was the decision of the court to do that.
Very interesting. Also, other than the heavy hand on critics, Kyrgyzstan is also in the middle of so many sort of challenges, social challenges. Earlier in our one-on-one conversation, Bruce, you were hinting towards one of them being like how to deal with the impact of coronavirus. Of course, coronavirus is not something of his own creation, but again, he has to deal with it. And also, winter is coming up soon, and winters in Kyrgyzstan are often harsh. And we hear reports about the looming electricity crisis. How similar or different is it compared to previous years?
You know, as far as the health crisis, I'm not sure that they did, it'd be hard to say that they performed poorly. I don't think the government was very organized, and it never has been since this started, of course. Every country has been trying to deal with this and going down their own routes to do it. It probably could have been more efficient, and more, the government could have had a more effective role in trying to get out healthcare programs. But like I said, unfortunately for everyone around the world, it's a learning experience for us all. So it's hard to level criticism at them. That given the situation when it started, I suppose they could have put a lot more time and paid a lot more attention to what was going on. That would have been something. When it comes to the electricity, it was a drought year, that's for sure. But they knew this was coming. Months ago, they knew that this was going to happen. That it'll be interesting to see how much that erodes. Emil mentioned that there was high popular support, or at least very vocal support. I would have to mention that certainly the results, the turnout for the referendum and the presidential election were relatively small. And if you actually dissected all the votes and stuff, you would see that, the amount of people that voted for Japarov in the presidential election was far less than half. And, and the same with the referendum. I think we did the math here, and it came out to like actually 20% of eligible voters actually supported the referendum to change the Constitution. But to get back, like I said, to the electricity and the coming winter, and it's been drought, so you can expect there's going to be food shortages. I have a feeling that that's going to eat into some of that popular support. It might have been a mistake to have elections in November, although it probably would have been worse if they'd done them later. But, I'm not in Bishkek. Sonia and Emil are in Bishkek. They could tell you what it's like to go out at night. Or, they've already started turning off lights for non-essential, non-residential use. And this is only going to get worse as we get into winter. And with the food situation, I couldn't say, but I got to think that since it was a drought and then there's going to be far fewer crops available, domestic crops available, that's also going to be hard on the Kyrgyz people, to get this around, to make ends meet every month. That we know that the economy slowed down in part because of the pandemic. So it'll be come November, some of that popular support that Japarov has enjoyed, I would expect would fade away once it gets time to parliamentary elections, which are already appearing to be rigged anyway, but like I said, I got to think that people will be less fond of Japarov and his gang and their policies by late November.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit later, Bruce. One more question before I move on. Emil, his government's performance, we spoke about the electricity and a drought and a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 to the country. So how his government's performance have been on jobs, for example, other social issues that Kyrgyz people are facing these days?
Yeah, this very multifaceted crisis is actually ongoing in all the directions, including jobs, including production, everything. When we talk about his government, earlier we were talking about the constitutional changes and the point of them. The biggest point of them was that it was argued that one person should handle everything. There should be full responsibility stacked with one person, and that person should carry that burden of responsibility. What has been going on in actual practice is one person has all the powers and none of the responsibility. The responsibility so far has been simply borne by people at much lower levels, and the de facto prime minister, who now the constitution stops calling a prime minister, is supposed to be more or less in the same old fashion, the scapegoat that has to be carrying all the dirty work, all the burdensome, more hopeless sort of responsibility in turning the economy around, and he's probably going to be scapegoated as we come closer to the election or right after. Overall, I think it's really hard to pinpoint to any sector, any sphere in the economy or social life where there has been improvement as opposed to backward slide. And I think a lot of this is indeed not necessarily of Japarov's and his government's doing, but a lot of it has to do with them not doing anything to revert the trends.
But when he
and
was
instead,
what I was thinking
right.
what I was thinking about is when he was leading those rallies of his sort of a fanatic supporters, and he was giving lots of promises. Has anything came out of those promises?
No, I think there's a widespread joke now, a rhyming joke here that says essentially that Japarov makes promises and then takes them back. In Kyrgyz, it sounds much smoother and nicer, but essentially everything has been staying at the level of promises. Of course, many things have been actually put into action. Most of the time, not so good things have been put into action. But again, most of the people at the ordinary level, citizens, they have not been reaping any benefits of what's been going on. Instead, what we've really seen is waste of even the few more or less professional, competent personnel, cadre in the government, coming of completely dilettante, incompetent leaders into different ministries, and this whole scope of legal reforms that Sania was talking about, only God knows wherever everything's headed.
Yeah. To your earlier point in terms of promises staying there, like we had a conversation the other day on Pakistan and people interpreting the Pakistani prime minister's promises, and they would call him like a U-turn prime minister. So whatever he says something today and he takes it back tomorrow. Very interesting. Of course, there have been significant development in the foreign policy front. Earlier, some of you pointed out on that. Sort of a cold face by Russia initially on some of the changes, and then you had a very bloody fight with Tajikistan, and now new developments in Afghanistan. What have been the ups and downs on that front? Let's continue the conversation talking about this and many other questions very shortly. First, let me recap the debate that today on the Majlis Podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Emil Juray, Bishkek-based political scientist, Sania Toktogaziba, constitutional law expert in Bishkek, Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio Free the Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlok Owazi. I'm Muhammad Tahir, host of the Majlis Podcast and Radio Free the Liberties media manager here in Washington, D.C., and we are discussing the developments in the past year in Kyrgyzstan in the context of the anniversary of a controversial election 1 year ago that brought the current current leader into power. On the foreign policy front, of course, Bruce, this is your area. What stands out is the conflict with Tajikistan. Let's talk about this in a minute. But Kyrgyzstan's ties with Russia are very important. How this has been under Japarov, as I said earlier, with the initial sign of Moscow showing sort of a cold face on some of the changes that has taken place immediately he coming into power. How it developed over the past year?
Well, of course, Japarov went to Moscow, and publicly, I'm sure that the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin don't want to make it look like there's any kind of big rift. I mean, you can get the undertones that this is, like you said, a kind of a cold reception. Russia is really against the change of leadership, certainly by, through popular unrest, and they weren't any happier with this latest change in leadership in Kyrgyzstan. In fact, they'd warned about that just several months before that, enough was enough, and Kyrgyzstan couldn't keep having these revolutions happen in their country. That said, like I said,
Bruce, Putin's reaction, like a sort of a cold face, that the way we interpreted it. So that was only about the leadership change, or it was something has to do with Japarov's personality?
It could be. I mean, it could be a lot more. It could be very personal. He doesn't have a huge amount of political experience. He's someone the Kremlin would have known about, but probably had never put into their equation of who could end up at the top in Kyrgyzstan. Like I said, when they meet publicly, and they've seen each other several times, not just during the visit, to Moscow, but of course they have to meet within the framework of these other larger groups, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, things like that. So the appearance is that that everything's okay between Russia and Kyrgyzstan. And Russia has certainly pushed to get their influence into Kyrgyzstan as much as possible. And really, there's not much Kyrgyzstan can do, and Japarov personally can do, to resist this, which is very unfortunate. But so they want to make it look like everything is a business as usual dealing with between Russia and Kyrgyzstan. But you just get, like I said, every time they meet, you get the impression that Putin gives the allotted amount of time to Japarov to say something or make statements or something, but it's all very scripted. There's no warmth between two when they're talking or anything like that. Putin doesn't go out of his way to praise him or say that this is what's happening in Kyrgyzstan is good or Japarov is a good leader. Nothing like that, And this stands, of course, in stark contrast to Putin's recent relationship with Emomali Rahman in Tajikistan, where they seem to be great friends. Rahman went to the World War II anniversary, end of World War II anniversary Victory Day celebrations in Moscow. He was the only leader that went. You get the impression that Putin consciously makes an effort to be close to Rahman when Japarov's around. Just to kind of show that the Kremlin favors someone who stays in power and keeps control over his country, even if he's a wicked despot, as opposed to someone like Japarov.
Very interesting. I don't know how it feels like on the ground. Maybe, Emil, you can talk about that. But, of course, and also there's another very important foreign policy matter that we should not forget to talk about is the conflict with Tajikistan, of course, as much as it is a foreign policy matter, also very, very emotional on both sides of the border in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. So, Emil, if you wish, let me bring you in here. So how this tension with Tajikistan has tested his leadership and how his performance has been evaluated locally on that?
Just like with the rest of his policies, where there's speaking in the language of economics, an inelastic sort of support that Sadr Japarov enjoys. No matter what, he will get that support. I think that sort of support is, of course, behind him, despite the obvious fact that what happened with Tajikistan and what has followed since then has been showing a lot of weakness, unpreparedness, lack of clear strategy or end goal with dealing with our neighbor. Now, the very fact of the conflict that happened is possibly the most tragic thing that has happened in this past year, in terms of lives lost, in terms of really the more of a little war thing that has taken place between the two countries for the first time since independence. And the facts, the objective facts on the ground will be actually established and will be studied, analyzed down the road. Sania has done a lot of work on that. But the burden that still stays with Sadr Japarov's government, with Kyrgyzstan, is really the burden of not understanding, not giving the necessary adequate level of understanding and diplomacy and appreciation of how how sensitive this question of borders is, and in a way giving an excuse for Emomali Rahmon, his military power, to build up and then open full-scale war. Now, I think in terms of slightly just for a second about President Japarov and President Putin's interaction, I think there's no surprise, of course, that Putin should not like him. It would be more surprising if Putin was showing a lot more of fondness or a positive attitude.
Right.
Not surprising that none of the leaders in Central Asia has given a lot of positive attitude to Japarov, simply because none of the presidents surrounding Kyrgyzstan would like to be seen by their own citizens, at least, as welcoming or being supportive of a leader that comes by the path that Japarov came. But and especially to Putin's dislike, of course, Japarov started out playing the more nationalist sort of leader, and Putin obviously cannot like that very much. But in the end, I think for Putin, most of these things, his reveries with Emomali Rahmon, with his attitude toward Putin, it's all very pragmatic, very calculated politics for him too. And Putin doesn't do it just because of the emotions.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question, Muhammad?
Sure.
And this is for both Emil and Sonia. You know, that obviously it was a disaster what happened along the Kyrgyz-Tajik border at the end of April. But I've always wondered, you know, that I know that Japarov had his sights set on Kumtor, but do either one of you see that he went after Kumtor so quickly after the Tajik-Kyrgyz problem? Was that a distraction? I mean, like I said, you knew that he was going to go after Kumtor sooner or later, but things went so badly on the Tajik border, and he just switched everyone's focus right over to Kumtor instead, within 2 weeks. Did you see it that way?
Perhaps. Partly, yes, I would answer to this question that I myself interpreted it as a strategic tool that has been used by Sadr Japarov and his team to distract the attention. Because frankly speaking, after the conflict on the border, the way that the government reacted to that, despite the fact that the citizens really wanted to speak up about the fact of aggression and etc., but they didn't do anything. And after we have applied to the International Criminal Court, where the communication has been signed by more than 50 victims, and then civil society organizations and etc. Actually, the presidential administration have written a press release claiming that these are the destructive forces they're trying to destabilize and etc. So this kind of reaction actually, I think, made the popularity or the ratings of the Sadr Japarov fall, particularly in Batken and in other regions as well. So of course he needed something to distract, to draw the attention back, and Kumtor, I think, was the only option available for them. I would agree.
Interesting. And also, we need to really move on. It's late in Bishkek. Our guests are joining from there. So, no Kyrgyz foreign policy discussion is complete without talking about China. Emil or Bruce, anyone, please jump in. Anything worth talking about in this front, like Kyrgyz-Chinese relations? Anything has changed over the past 1 year?
So far, Kyrgyz-Chinese relations have not seen any visible, clear move. The topic of Kyrgyz-Chinese relations was very high on the agenda, very high under the attention of the general public last year when Sadr Japarov came. Indeed, paying off the Chinese debt was really one of the biggest slogans that Sadr Japarov took up. Made it a promise, and it was one of the biggest demands on the part of the population. The looming large debt to China was something that late in his days and months, President Jembekov was really struggling. They were almost begging to postpone the upcoming regular payment installment. So that's where it stood. And but outside of Shanghai Cooperation Organization dialogues, conversations, there hasn't really been, very high level and noticeable important interaction on the two sides. There's been some help still received, again, from China recently. There is a revitalized talks about China-Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan railroad, this never-ending and never materializing sort of idea. But beyond these, I think, no, we cannot say that qualitatively much has changed between the two countries.
Interesting. Since Bruce, you just did a story on that, that's why I will ask, and I expect you just briefly touch on this one, in the new developments in Afghanistan. I don't know if there was anything happening except the Kyrgyzstan sent a delegation to meet the Taliban. Is there anything to read into Kyrgyzstan's approach toward these, new events in Afghanistan?
Like with a lot of countries, we're getting two different messages here, but I think Kyrgyzstan did a good job of, when the delegation went down, of trying to just make sure that it was clear to the people running Afghanistan that Kyrgyzstan really didn't want to get involved in this at all, and to leave them alone. That said, Japarov had one of the strongest statements when the Shanghai Cooperation Organization met, or no, it was the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. He said having a theocratic government in Afghanistan was a threat to all CSTO member countries. Which was, like I said, the furthest out that anyone at that conference or at the summit went as far as commenting on Afghanistan. So, you get a little of both. He's clearly uncomfortable with it. So are a lot of people. But I think they shored things up pretty well and let the Taliban know that they really don't have much of an interest except for trade interest with Afghanistan, and they don't want any problems.
Interesting. Okay. So let's bring the conversation to local developments. Sania, the upcoming elections that's coming up in less than 2 months now, I guess. So what stands out to you in this election, the preparation for this election compared to the previous elections? Is it going to be more fairer, less fairer? Anything stands out to you?
So it's definitely going to be completely different in comparison with previous elections, because now we have new rules, except for the party elections on the proportional system. We also have the single district, so which means now what really strikes me, I have seen all this district, how they have been shaped and drawn. To a certain extent, I think the way how it has been drawn can be characterized as gerrymandering, like frankly speaking, and which in itself can cause a lot of post-election conflict in those districts, especially in the south, especially if, let's say, there will be the ethnic Uzbek minority candidate who loses. And the way how all these districts has been drawn now creates this opportunity that most likely they're going to lose, And of course, the way in this single district mandates, it's practically impossible to incorporate quotas. So in those districts, less likely women will be elected, so which means we're going to have substantially decreased amount of women to be represented in parliament, which in itself is going to affect to the gender policies in Kyrgyzstan. So these elections are going to be different because fundamentally now, according to the constitution, we have completely different rules as to them. And as for the fairness, it's really hard to prognose, but now in comparison with the last year, we actually have very few opposition parties that are going to participate. And this is really something that is different in comparison. I think there's going to be a lot of spoiler parties, pro-governmental, and most of the strong-handed candidates and politicians are actually planning to be elected through the single district rather than political parties. Okay. So these are something that I could highlight.
Okay. Emil, agree, disagree? Any thoughts in terms of how this is going so far and where we might end up? And also, earlier you raised this point, I guess, Emil, thank you very much for that. The popularity of Japarov after 1 year in power, where his current level of popularity puts him in terms of the outcome of the election, or your prognosis about the outcome of the election?
The elections are likely, somewhat predictably, to produce a very pliable, very loyal majority in the parliament. A resounding majority, perhaps, that will be able to support on which Japarov will be able to rely. And not that he had any problems with the current parliament, but the elections must be had. But indeed, as Sania said, the electoral system has changed quite dramatically. I can only imagine whether there will be hiccups along the way, especially on the day of voting, when the proportional representation part, based on the party lists, will have to be also including preferential voting method, where people can easily start making mistakes, and which may result in broken ballots or spoiled ballots. So that sort of things, nuances may occur. But overall, overall, I think the parliamentary elections already now, even before the campaign has started, the government, relevant agencies of the government have been working hard to make it more predictable, sort of remove the most distrustable or suspicious forces. Now, again, Kyrgyz elections are a matter of unpredictability overall in the larger picture. I mean, elections are where things can turn differently than what you expect. So you never know.
Unpredictably predictable. Interesting. Bruce, last question. What's the post-election scenario will look like from your perspective? I guess he's here to stay. He's a young man, energetic as far as I can see, and looks like he likes the attention. So what's next?
Well, I agree that I think this is already being managed so that the majority of people that get elected will be Japarov supporters. He's going to, because his support is kind of fading away, he's going to need to make sure that most of the deputies that get elected are supporters. So he has support actually from that quarter instead of dissent. Again, but predictably unpredictable is a great way of looking at it. You just never know. It's complicated, they've done where they've had single mandate and party lists at the same time before. But Sonia has said that people are going to run in a lot of powerful politicians are going to run in single mandate districts because they made the party list system so complicated. I had to have this explained to me a couple times, that in order to root out corruption or buying positions in the party list, which was chronic in Kyrgyzstan. You supposedly gave $1 million, your name was number 1, 2, or 3 or something on the party list, you're guaranteed to get a seat. Now you have to vote for a party, and every party has a number, and then as a person running for that party, you have an individual number also. So you can be running from party number 3 and you are candidate number 17, and the voters are supposed to know that. And like I said, on paper, it looks good because that way you can't put the top people as the first 5 people and expect that they will take the seats if the party gets the votes. But it's really confusing, and I imagine a lot of people are going to be unimpressed with this particular thing, and there'll be room for grievances and saying, I don't know, the whole thing was so complicated. And, and we did redistricting, gerrymandering, I think is a correct term, which allowed people, influential and rich people, to move it, essentially guaranteed them victory in the election coming up. So, but I'm certain that at least they're angling for a pro-Japarov parliament to get into power, or to be elected anyway.
Let's see. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to conclude the conversation here, but we will get back to it as the election comes closer. So with this, thank you very much. Bruce Pannier, the editor of Ready for Freedom Liberty Central Asia blog Qishloq Owazi. And big thanks goes to Dr. Emil Jurayev, Bishkek-based political scientist, and Sanya Toktagazeva, constitutional law expert, also in Bishkek. Thank you very much. And this is from me, Muhammad Tahir, host of the Majlis and Ready for Freedom Liberty's current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. Until next week, bye-bye.